Concepts of international relations are as old as the hills. We find references to concepts of international relations even in ancient times. In ancient China, in 6th century BC, Confucius, and 3rd century BC, Mencius discussed different concepts of international relations. In ancient India, Monu and Kautilya referred to important ideas of international relations. Monu dealt with the inviolability of diplomats and rules of warfare, while Kautilya developed the concept of balance of power. Ancient Roman jurists developed legal principles, basic principles of international law. Another important contribution was made by 5th century BC Greek historian Thucydides, who propagated the idea that there is a natural inequality among states, big and small, and both big and small powers would do better if they adapt to this reality for their sheer survival. In ancient India, there existed 16 republican kingdoms according to Buddhist texts of the time. In China, empire lasted for about 4,000 years, down to the first decade of 20th century. But these are not examples of real sovereign states. Sovereign states is a reality of modern age. It came with the advent of modernity in Europe. And it's agreed on all hands that modern state system arose after the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which marked the end of 30 years' war in Europe. It created the modern system of territorial sovereign states, which is still existing amongst us. Now, these sovereign states were born out of the ashes of feudalism. From 5th century AD to 15th century, in Europe there existed social system which is called feudalism. Feudal society was a sort of a legal and military arrangement in which the emperor stood and reigned at the top. Below him there were many kings spread across many countries. The kings were granted exclusive control over lands, vast territories of lands, on the condition of fealty to the emperor and, most importantly, on the condition of military service in times of necessity with men and arms. The kings, in their turn, granted similar favors to lords, and the lords, in their turn, granted similar rights to the knights. At the bottom of the social hierarchy, there existed a class of peasants or serfs who were tied to the land on conditions of loyalty and service to their immediate overlords. So, sovereign power lay scattered, suffused throughout the entire realm of the emperor. There was not a single repository of supreme political power. That is what we understand by sovereignty. First important concept was the concept of sovereignty. A state is a complete state only when it is sovereign. Now, what is the implication? What is the meaning of this sovereignty? Sovereignty signifies complete, absolute control on the part of the state or the government or the monarch or the ruler over the entire territory of within the state and its subjects. It's a legally supreme control, unfettered, indivisible, cannot be shared with any other external power. And the state at the same time must be independent of external control. So, sovereignty, we can very well understand, is a very essential requirement of statehood. And allied to this is the concept of non-intervention. Article 2, paragraph 7 of United Nations Charter mentions this categorically, that nothing contained in this charter shall empower any state to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of a state. No other state, no external agency shall interfere with the domestic affairs of a state. It implies the significance of this concept presumes existence of certain internationally accepted conventions. Another important concept is the very existence of international law. Takes it for granted that there exists a society of states. It is an international community. So, whether there is an international community or not, it is very much debated in international relations. There have been many thinkers who refuse to accept that there is an international society. International society is an anarchical society. Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century British political thinker, or Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli of 15th century Italy, he was an Italian diplomat, or the 6th century BC Greek historian Thucydides, for instance. They were all called what is now known as realists, classical realists. They believed that the states should try to develop themselves as much strong as possible, and nothing beyond the state is there. There cannot be any society of state because there is no international government. But this is not accepted by all. Classical jurists like Grotius or philosopher like Immanuel Kant or another important jurist, Emeric Vattel, they believed in the concept of international community. Another important concept which was harped upon mostly with greatest emphasis by Niccolo Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes was the principle of national interest. Machiavelli went as far as to say, a prince diminishes his power if he helps another. So the guiding principle of a nation should be to achieve maximum prosperity and welfare, and they can afford to be even amoral politically. We need not be bothered by considerations of conventional morality in international relations with other states, because they are all our potential enemies in view of the fact that there is an anarchical condition prevailing in international sphere. Nations' security, welfare should be the highest consideration. Now, this concept may have limitations because it is based upon a pessimistic view of human nature. But it goes without saying that national interest is an important factor to be taken into account foreign policy making. This is the most important consideration behind making of foreign policy of a state, interest of one's own nation. Allied to these concepts was another concept that played a very important role in history of modern Europe. The concept of balance of power. The idea of balance of power emerged with the development of modern science, with the increasing popularity of the concept of equilibrium. The guiding principle behind balance of power is the groupings of the states should be done in such a way that no one state or no group of state becomes over-dominant over other group or other states. Generally what is needed is, and a role which has been played to a great extent by Great Britain, you need a balancer. Britain, because of her insular position, remained aloof from the affairs of Europe, engaged in her overseas trade across the world. But in all European major political conflicts, Britain always took sides, generally on the weaker side, so that the balance could be redressed. This balancing game between great powers of Europe, numbering about 7 or 8 during Congress of Vienna, and it remained about 8 in number at the time of the outbreak of the First World War. This balancing game continued. But the balance, as I have said, became so rigid that it was no longer possible to avoid a direct armed conflict. So the First World War resulted. So these are the most important concepts which have evolved over time from the Peace of Westphalia. Another concept which became a crying need after the First World War was the need for an international organization. And a new age of international organization began with the founding of the League of Nations in 1919 after the Paris Peace Conference. Prior to the League of Nations, which was founded in 1919, was the Congress of Vienna. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna evolved certain principles of relationships among great powers of Europe, and it also developed an understanding among great powers, what is known as the Concert of Europe. America, surprisingly enough, was the leading spokesman of a new international organization. America's President Woodrow Wilson himself was a professor of political science, and he had a completely liberal, idealist, universal outlook. And he preached that, in fact, the League of Nations was his brainchild. Unfortunately, American people, as represented by the American Senate, did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles of which the Covenant of the League of Nations was a part. American Senate did not ratify it, so America could not become a party to the League of Nations. Nevertheless, the League of Nations was born in 1919, and it was because of the liberal idealism of people like Woodrow Wilson and Norman Angell, who spoke, who highlighted that modern air warfare is so costly that to achieve peace through war was a great illusion of our time. We find liberal idealism was the main inspiration behind the formation of the League of Nations, but it was an inadequate guide to international politics because the reality of the situation was rather crude. Edward Hallett Carr, the British writer, severely criticized the liberal idealists by saying that they completely misunderstood, misread the facts of history. This approach came to be known as realism. Realism, therefore, posed the first major debate in international relations theory. The League proved to be a failure, and Second World War emerged. As a consequence of that, the United Nations was formed after the Second World War in 1945. Very soon after the Second World War, many new nations emerged on the scene, particularly in Asia. India got her liberation, followed by independence to Indonesia and other Asian countries. And ultimately, by early mid-60s, 1960s, large number of nations of Africa and Asia got their national liberation, liberation from the bondage of colonial rule. As a consequence of that, the membership of the United Nations, which was formed after the Second World War in 1945. In 1945, the strength of membership stood at only 50. But by 1970, it rose to as much as 160. This is known as worldwide expansion of the Western political system, modern state system. In the 1950s, an effort was made by people, by scholars, that international relations could be made into a completely scientific discipline. Just like we have laws governing physical reality, we can discover objective, verifiable laws for our international political relations. But this movement, which was known as behavioralist movement, soon petered out, but it left a great impact on subsequent theory making. Between 1950s and 1970s, we find there was a revival, reformulation of both liberalism and realism. The behavioral movement provoked the second debate. Thereafter emerged a new form of liberalism. Despite there was bitter rivalry between USA and the USSR, economic situation in Europe was reviving. There was increase in travel and communications, trade and investment, and regional economic integration. So these liberal ideas became popular. But by the end of 1970s, again realism came to the fore. It came to be known as neo-realism. It was because of the fact that despite the progress of economic integration moving at a great pace in Western Europe, there was bitter rivalry or Cold War between the two superpowers, as a result of which neo-realism came to be accepted as a very important explanatory guide to international relations. But with the end of the Cold War, in the 1990s, there emerged a new approach, international society approach. International society approach was not born, not raised in United States of America. It was a product of United Kingdom. People often call it the English school, but it's better, it's called the international society approach, because many contributors to this field have come from other countries like Australia or Canada or South Africa even. Two important spokesmen of this approach have been Martin White and Hedley Bull. International society approach rejected behavioral approach. International relations is not a scientific discipline. It can never be. It must accept historical wisdom, historical knowledge, norms and judgment. It also rejected any hard and fast distinction between realist and liberal perceptions. According to international society approach, there is simultaneous presence of liberal, realist elements in international politics. For example, the United Nations organization. It has its Security Council, which is a clear recognition of inequality among powers, among states. It vests responsibility upon 5 important members, permanent members of the Security Council for the maintenance of international peace and security. At the same time, it recognizes the principle of sovereign equality of all member nations, as is evident from the character and composition of the General Assembly, which consists of all, at present, 193 full-fledged sovereign members of the United Nations.